The government is bankrupt, the corporations are bankrupt, many people are bankrupt and struggling. Yet this is the best economy ever if you are in the top 1%, this is the greatest economy ever, no question about it. Just 5 months into fiscal 2021, the US government has already run a budget deficit of over $1 trillion. In a year of massive deficits, the US federal government charted its biggest monthly shortfall of fiscal year 2021 in February. The ability of this government to pay just the interest on our national debt once it escapes these current levels will be something to keep your eye on. Taxes will have to be raised, maybe dramatically, and at that point, the stock market will go south with the endgame clearly seen by all. On March 1, the US national debt eclipsed $28 trillion for the first time. According to the national debt clock, the debt-to-GDP ratio stands at 129.8%. Despite the lack of concern in the mainstream, debt has consequences. Studies have shown that a debt-to-GDP ratio of over 90% retards economic growth by about 30%. This throws cold water on the conventional, spend now worry about the debt later, mantra, along with the frequent claim that, we can grow ourselves out of the debt, now popular on both sides of the aisle in DC. We also have a ballooning trade deficit. The annual trade deficit for goods came in at an all-time high, increasing $3.4 billion to a record $221.1 billion. This broke the previous record for imported goods of $218.9 billion set in October 2018. The overall trade deficit was up 1.9% to $68.2 billion. That was just shy of the 14-year high of $69 billion reached in November. And because of the accumulation of all these trade deficits is the problem, because America has enormous debts to the rest of the world, and we are basically selling out our country because we have all this debt and the world is going to collect. They're buying our assets, our real estate, they're buying our stocks. The US economy is overly dependent on unproductive debt. Not surprisingly, secular growth rates have been trending lower for 3 decades. The massive amount of unproductive debt added in the last year will only further reduce future growth rates. The government, or the Federal Reserve, is printing money and just giving it to unemployed people who aren't making stuff, but they're spending money. And so what they're doing is they're buying the stuff that people in other countries are employed making. So, it's the productivity of the rest of the world that Americans are living off of, and the trade deficit evidence that shows you that our whole economy, our whole recovery, is a fraud. The reason for the lack of production is America's lack of competitiveness. America is burdened by too many regulations. On top of that, the artificially low interest rates discourage savings. In order to manufacture stuff, you need capital equipment, machines and factories. Today people no longer have to work for a living. All they have to do is buy stocks or get an easy job that offers a 401k policy, and just sit back and watch all of this free Federal Reserve money being dumped into it. And when it gets high enough, they withdraw some of it and buy a new home with it, and at rock bottom, interest rates to boot. The only kicker is that in the end, they will end up losing it all when the housing market collapses. A good deal now will become a terrible deal later when all of the Federal Reserve benefits today will all be gone next year. I believe the biggest economic problem facing the US is and will continue to be a cultural one. People are expecting more and more free money. The deficit is merely a symptom of that problem. If the culture of America had remained one of personal independence and diligent savings and work, we would not be where we are today. The entitlements have done nothing to help the poor. It has merely created more of them by creating massive disincentives for marriage, and as stats show, kids raised in single-parent homes almost always copy that and become another poverty stat. Entitlements are rotting America. They need to go, but they never will. Once an entitlement becomes law, it's nearly impossible to reverse due to the election cycle. If you promise to cut an entitlement, you will never get elected. Only when collapse is imminent do things change, and by then it's too late. Welcome back to the Atlantis Report. You are here for your daily dose of the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Please take a second to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and don't forget to also hit the notification bell. All bubbles eventually burst, and the bigger the bubble, the bigger the burst. U.S. households are now sitting on a record $14 trillion in mortgages, credit cards, student loans, and other forms of debt. That marks the biggest annual increase since before the financial crisis. According to the New York Federal Reserve, which is one of the 12 banks that make up the Federal Reserve System, total household debt balances rose by $601 billion just in the last year, which now tops $14 trillion for the first time ever in U.S. history. The last time the growth was that large was in 2007 when household debt rose by over $1 trillion. Auto loans, credit cards, and student loans have increased by almost 30% since 2003. Why are Americans so in debt? If the economy's as good as we're constantly being told it is, then why are Americans not saving any money? Why don't average consumers have any cash on hand to buy things? Why do they have to borrow so damn much? The U.S. household debt numbers are out, and they ain't pretty. In other words, for 5 straight years, Americans' borrowing habits have gone up without fail. The total U.S. household debt rose by more than $600 billion from last year. That means that for the first time ever, the American household debt surpassed $14 trillion. Household debt hovers around $15 trillion. The real economy is in disarray. And by the way, the borrowing is across the board. Student debt went up from $1.46 trillion in the final quarter of last year to $1.51 trillion in the first quarter of this year. And you know who holds $100 billion of that debt? Americans over the age of 60 who apparently still haven't been able to pay their college. Auto debt has now risen for 35 consecutive quarters. 11 straight years. We now owe $1.3 trillion in car loans. 5% of those haven't made a payment in more than 90 days. Auto loan delinquency going through the roof. And how about credit cards? Americans now owe more than $1.4 trillion in credit card debt, which is up from $854 billion just 5 years ago. By the way, credit card delinquencies just hit a 2-year high as well. More than 8% of credit card holders aren't even making a minimum payment. So in all the hoopla about the great economy that we keep hearing, very few are telling you just how bloated our economy actually is. Yes, we're consuming more as we're constantly reminded to do just that. But we are doing it on borrowed time and borrowed money. This is just a giant bubble that's waiting to burst. The US doesn't produce anything, except military goods. We're just living off credit and the fiat dollar and paying off our debt with more debt. The 2008 bubble is effervescence compared to the current mega bubble, about to go blammo. Next on the agenda, jailing the poor for debt, then making the work it off while charging them for jailing accommodations. Perpetual peonage. The Fed, in other words, our central bank, which is a panel of unelected bankers who decide how much money to print out of thin air to stimulate the economy because they don't think our economy is healthy enough to sustain itself. Those bankers just announced that they're gonna continue pumping billions and billions into the banks so they can pay their loans. This intervention has nothing to do with reality and everything to do with artificial economic manipulation. The Fed is creating a monster bubble, never seen before in history. You can't print free money when there's no one buying it. That will eventually become a problem, and we're ignoring it. Oh well, that's what happens when you believe in narratives instead of facts. Meanwhile, the U.S. deficit surged 25% in fiscal 2020 and is over $1 trillion in just the 5 months into fiscal 2021. Yes, you heard that right, the budget deficit for the first 5 months of fiscal 2021 is $1 trillion already. The sea of red ink is getting deeper and deeper in Washington, with the federal government already racking up a budget deficit that is averaging close to $200 billion a month. All the red ink has brought the total national debt to $28.062 trillion. This debt level is enslaving Americans. The extension to the national debt is driving the country into bankruptcy. This does not look good. And cannot end well. The deficit will be the end of it. You can't continue to run a business without addressing it. It's so huge now and will get bigger. This isn't going to end well. There are 2 ways to conquer and enslave a nation. One is by the sword. The other is by debt, John Adams. The masterminds want to drive everyone into cryptos for the Great Reset. This is about future control over all transactions in their authoritarian sandbox. I buy physical metal. There is no such thing as paying a premium for physical metal. That is the real price. The paper price is the discount or fake price. Physical means real, no premium. Paper means fake, fake price. Bitcoin could go to zero value tomorrow. It has no value aside from hype. It's actually a great study in the power of hype.